joining us in this conversation.
Absolutely.
And the first question is, you taught in public schools for 30 years. So what is your opinion on the current state of public education?
It seems to me that it's getting narrower and narrower and narrower and not serving a lot of kids very well. And I think the crux of it is there is so much emphasis on going to college that everybody is led to believe that if they don't get a 4.6 and get really high test scores and go to an elite school, that life is over. And it just seems to me that that is incredibly limiting. There are many, many, many great schools to go to in this country after high school. 2-year schools, 4-year schools, vocational schools, apprenticeships. And of course, when we're talking about apprenticeships, we're not really talking about schools. And I know a lot of people who've made their way in this life without any kind of an education after high school or even after skipping high school. So it seems to me that there just isn't nearly enough emphasis, and certainly not in the schools, on what people's options are and how they can go about getting a good education.
Would you distinguish between education and schooling, or education and learning, some kind of distinctions there? What's your view on those?
Well, if schooling means being subject to compulsory education and going because you have to through high school, I think that's a really narrow definition. As a matter of fact, I don't think it's a definition of education. I think it's a matter of schooling. It's a matter of, you got to go to school, you got to do what you're told, you got to sit still, you can't chew gum unless you have permission, you can't go to the restroom unless you have permission, you have to study this, maybe when you want to study that, and that to me is not education, it's schooling. Schooling, education is a much, much, much broader kind of thing. I mean, education can happen anywhere, anytime. Lots of different ways of doing it. I have one graduate who's now in his 3rd year of an apprenticeship. I love his story. He didn't like high school, he didn't do well in it. Hands-on kind of guy, really hard to sit still for any length of time. And his mother finally homeschooled him for his final year in high school. Then he came to me and got a diploma. Then he did a really systematic search of what his options were. He went into an apprenticeship, and he's now in his 3rd year in an apprenticeship in HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. And he says he has a good chance of making a 6-figure income when he's fully trained. And as a matter of fact, he comes here and services our furnace once a year. And the really interesting thing about his story, I think, is that he now has no trouble whatsoever sitting through 8-hour classes that are connected to his apprenticeship, whereas in high school he was having trouble sitting through 50-minute classes.
And how old is that student now?
I'd have to get out my records and look. He's probably 20.
So he found a way to not go to college, but go through the trades and apprenticing to find a career that was well-paying and satisfying.
Right, exactly. And at the other end of the spectrum, one young lady I worked with a number of years ago was accepted at MIT when she was 14, arrived when she was 15, and was doing extremely well. She happened to have stopped after 2 years, and she's now the co-owner of a venture capital firm in San Francisco and doing extremely well with that. She won a Teal Fellowship, which is offered by the co-founder of PayPal. And she was handed $100,000 with a promise not to go to school for 2 years and see what she could do as an entrepreneur. And she's doing really fine. On the other hand, I've had a lot of kids who go to college. I'm not talking against going to college. I'm simply saying that it's not the right answer for everybody, for people who go there, like doing it, feel like they're learning a lot, feel comfortable there. That's great. But that's just not true for everybody. It doesn't work for everybody.
This young lady who got accepted to MIT at age 14, was it her extensive transcript, or what do you think got her into MIT?
Well, she had never been involved in any K through 8 school at all. She was entirely homeschooled in a very independent kind of way. And when she was 12 years old, she talked her way into a lab position at UC San Francisco, which is the University of California's medical sciences complex. And she was doing real work in a real lab at 12. And she talked her way into that. And when she had been doing that for a while, she came and talked to me and said, "Do you think I have any chance of getting into college?" And the more she told me, the more I was convinced that she did. So we put down on a transcript, a detailed transcript that ran for about 15 pages, everything that she had done, including her lab work. Gave her a lot of credit for that. She audited a lot of classes at UC San Francisco, which were graduate level classes. She learned a lot on her own. She used MIT OpenCourseWare, and she did take a couple of courses formally, but only a couple. And one biology professor at UC Berkeley, who was one of the instructor or the professor in one of the classes where she was formally enrolled, said she was the best student he'd had in 25 years. Always there, always answered questions, always had her hand up, obviously understood what he was saying. She was just at the top of the heap as far as he was concerned, and he had 25 years of experience. And this was when she was not yet 14.
Very nice. And in your book, you say that you sometimes would be angry in school, teaching in the public school system.
Right.
When you would see students treated badly. What type of things would you see, or that would make you feel angry towards the current school system?
I could go on and on and on about that. Let me just give you one or maybe two examples. One student, and I actually don't remember who this was, but one student went down to the counseling office. He asked some questions about the California High School Proficiency Exam, which is a test that people can take when they're 16 or through the 12th grade, or at the end of the 10th grade or through the 10th grade. And if they pass this test given by the state, they get a certificate that's equivalent to a high school diploma. It exempts them from compulsory education and allows them free entry to community colleges or do anything else they want. And I had a conversation with a student a number of years ago who went down to the counseling office and asked about the proficiency exam, and what she was told was entirely wrong, which made me angry. And then I got on the phone and called a bunch of other high schools in separate school districts over the mountains from here. We're doing this conversation in Santa Cruz County. We call going over the Santa Cruz Mountains, going over the hill. So I called several school districts over the hill and talked to a variety of people, from vice principals to secretaries. And I asked the same two questions about the proficiency exam. And initially I talked to 10 different high schools. And the number of schools that answered both questions correctly was exactly 0. And in other words, they're making false statements to kids. They're not telling kids the truth about this test. I repeated the experiment 5 years later, and I called 5 other schools, and the 5th school gave me correct answers. And if I remember correctly, that's 1 out of 15 schools that answers the question correctly. And if I remember correctly, that works out to 7%. And 7% on anybody's grading scale is a failing grade.
Do you think it's intentional, or it's just ignorance or neglect?
That is a question that has plagued me forever. And, well, obviously I haven't lived forever, but it's plagued me for a long time. And my best guess is people are so mired in conventional education and traditional outlooks that something like the proficiency exam comes along and it's a threat, because people sincerely believe that everybody has to be locked up in high school for 4 years if they're going to succeed in life. And so they believe that this way of getting out of high school halfway through it is a threat. And so they don't want to believe in it. And so some gossip starts to circulate about what the truth is, which isn't the truth at all. And people buy into it without actually going and reading the literature about the exam, and then they just keep propagating it. And I think in many instances, they think they're telling people the truth. Although one of the people I called in this experiment to find out what other high schools were saying, one vice principal practically spat into the phone and said, I am really proud to say that nobody in this school has ever taken that thing, he said. And so he obviously had an extremely negative opinion of the test. Nobody in the school, he said, had ever taken the test, in spite of the fact that schools have a legal obligation. They are required by the California Education Code to tell their students about the test. At the high school I worked at for 20 years, about all anybody ever did was put it in a book called Courses and Choices, which is a course booklet of the courses that were offered at that high school. And that was about it. And unless students happened to stumble across something in that booklet about the test, they didn't know about it. And by the way, fairly recently I've looked up what that same school says about the proficiency exam, and it's very misleading. And I can't say it's false, but it's really misleading. What it says is if you take the test, you can leave school and go to college or work, period. And the fact of the matter is you can do anything you want. You can take off and travel around the world, you can start a company, you can sit at home and read a pile of books for a while, you can do whatever you want to do.
Would you recommend teenagers take the proficiency exam?
I really shy away from recommending anything. Somebody will call me up, I'll have an in-person conversation with people, and they'll say, well, what do you think is best? And I say, I don't know what's best. That's for you, if I'm talking to a student, that's for you to decide with your parents and for you to make your own life. I can't crawl into your skin and know what's going to work for you. What I'm here for primarily is to tell you what's possible. It's up to you to take that and decide which direction you want to go in. But I do really encourage people to take the proficiency exam, because if you pass it, you have a legal right to stay in school. You don't have to leave school. And I think one of the big problems with schooling is that it's compulsory. You have no choice. You haven't made a decision to go to school. But if you take the test, get a certificate, you can nail it to your bedroom wall, you can wake up every morning, you can look at that certificate, you know that you have a right to leave school anytime you want to. So going to school now is a choice. And I think that makes a huge amount of difference. I'm going to school because I choose to, not because there's a law that says I have to. Or, alternatively, I can leave school and go to a community college or do anything else I want to do. And by the way, going to a community college can lead to admission to four-year schools based entirely on a community college record. It has nothing to do with high school. And people can go from a four-year college to graduate school, professional schools, whatever. Part of the reason I'm doing this work is because of my own son, and he has no experience in high school. He didn't spend a single day in high school. He has no documents from high school, but he has a bachelor's and a PhD. And he did that by starting at a community college at a very young age.
Amazing. So you have run your own private school, Beach High School, for over 20 years, which is awesome and very inspiring.
Okay, well let me just stop you if I may.
Sure.
And say, actually, my private school has been in existence since 1980. I have been working in it full time for 23 years, but I started it while I was still working in a public high school. And I would occasionally do something for a public high school student through my private high school, because the laws that govern what happens in private high schools are absolutely minimal. The laws that govern public high schools exist in 4 or 5 fat volumes that would take up a good part of a law library shelf. But the number of sections of that code that apply to private schools, which I have set up, which any parent can set up fairly easily, probably it boils down to, well, it doesn't probably, I know for a fact, it boils down to a few pages. And private schools are essentially unregulated. You have to have a curriculum on file, and there's complete flexibility about what your curriculum is, and you have to have an attendance policy. My attendance policy, for example, is that everybody wakes up and learns stuff, and so you can't stop people from learning, so they're present every day, so that's my attendance policy.
On the record.
On the record.
So that's the attendance policy. And then what's your curriculum policy?
My curriculum basically says that the curriculum is whatever parents and the student and I decide it is. And there's a section of the education code that says that schools have to offer to students what is traditionally taught in the public schools. And I interpret that, and the homeschooling organization that I've been part of for a long time interprets that the same way, and that is that offer means offer. So if I say to a student, do you want to study English? And the student says no, then I've offered it. And if I say, do you want to study physics? And the student says no, I've offered it. So I make my students aware of the fact that there are resources that they can use to study any subject they want, including the traditional ones, and then they're free to do what they please. And they don't have to do any of the traditional stuff. Although if they want to go directly to a four-year school rather than start at a community college, they need to do some traditional stuff in some way or other, but they don't need to do it in a traditional way necessarily.
Very nice. And also in your book, you did mention that Beach High School was started while you're still a teacher.
Right.
And so can you talk about being nominated or the conversation for State Teacher of the Year in California and that kind of relationship with that gentleman?
Yes, I certainly can. At one point, not too many years before I left the public schools, the principal of the high school that I was then teaching in wanted to nominate me for State Teacher of the Year. The following year, he started writing bad evaluations for me. And I don't know for certain what exactly happened. I suspect, I don't know, I suspect that he was getting pressure from the district to get me to shut up, basically. Because what I was doing was I was telling people in high school, telling the students, that look, if high school for you is a rich and fulfilling and useful experience, by all means do it. But if it isn't those things, don't do it because you don't have to. There are alternatives. You can take the proficiency exam. Of course, at that time I wasn't offering diplomas to people, but you can take the proficiency exam. You can take community college courses while you're in high school. You can take distance learning courses while you're in high school. Online courses didn't exist at the time, but there were still distance learning courses called correspondence courses. And you can do all those things. You don't have to do the standard thing. There are lots of options, and that kind of message being propagated in a public high school is not workable, I found out. And so I was accused, especially after I started at my own school, I was accused of conflict of interest. That really wasn't legal because there's a California code, I don't remember which code it's in, that says that a state organization can accuse people of conflict of interest if they have established a conflict of interest policy, and only then. And the district had not established a conflict of interest policy, but I was nevertheless accused of conflict of interest. And that really boggles my mind, because it seems to me, I mean, the analogy that I have used on a number of occasions, if you go to a podiatrist because your feet hurt, and the podiatrist sees that you have bone cancer, but doesn't want to send you to another specialist because he wants you as his patient, he gives you foot powder and sends you home. That's malpractice. And it seems to me that it's educational malpractice if you can't see that a kid needs something different, or you do see it and you refuse to offer him anything different. I mean, there are kids, obviously, who are not thriving in high school. And I think there's a substantial amount of evidence, not necessarily coming from me, but it's all over the place in books and TV programs and speakers and conferences and so on, and research, and solid academic research, that a variety of ways of providing an education to kids works. And the standard one-size-fits-all, you gotta go to college route doesn't work for everybody.
So what inspires you to create Beach High School over 30 years ago?
Well, what led up to that, two things basically. One was way back in the mid-60s, I worked with a small group of kids to establish a special program for their senior year that gave them a lot of flexibility that kids in the school didn't have in general, and this was an experimental school. But the kids I worked with in a program called Senior Seminar, there were only 13 of them, didn't have to go to classes they were enrolled in. They could devise their own classes, and they had a hangout place in the science building where I was teaching, where they could come and spend their time and do what they pleased. I caught up with, well, I kept in touch with some of those people over the years. Most of them I lost touch with. And about 5-6 years ago, I decided I wanted to try and track them down, and I succeeded in all but one case. And we had a gathering at Morro Bay down on the coast of California, and every single one of them had a graduate degree. And several of them were in education. 3 or 4 of them were college professors. And in this special program at the high school at the time, everybody was saying, oh, West Beach is ruining their life, they're screwing up their senior year, they're never going to get anywhere. And in fact, they got lots of places. It was basically a program where they had a lot of control over what happened to them during their senior year. And one of the members of that program tried to perpetuate the program for subsequent years, but he failed. We had a hard time talking the administration into it in the first place, and they didn't want it to continue because, in my opinion, I came to the conclusion several years before I quit the public schools that the public schools are primarily about having power over kids. That comes long before education, because obviously it's compulsory. And to compel people to do anything, you have to have power over them. And if you lose the power, you've lost the game. And giving kids a lot of freedom within a public school is just contrary to the whole notion of compulsory education.
Mm-hmm. Why would schools want control or power over kids?
Because, as I said, it's compulsory, and you lose the game if you take away the compulsion. My primary goal, especially in my last 5-10 years of teaching, was to give whatever power the kids perceived that I had away, and let them be as free as I possibly could within a public institution, which turns out to be not very free. Although in the gifted program that I ran for 10 years, kids did have the option of taking all of their classes at the local community college. That was something we worked out with the community college, something I worked out with the community college. And they did have a lot of freedom. They also had a permanent hall pass, so they could move around the school as they chose, as long as they stayed out of trouble. The second thing that led me to start up Beach High School was my own son, who very clearly, very early on, demonstrated a lot of natural mathematical talent. And when he was in a public school in the 4th grade, I gave him an 8th grade math book, which he mastered in about 3 weeks. Also during that same year, he was sick a lot. We went in and out of clinics. Nobody could ever figure out what was wrong. He ran a low-grade fever. He complained of lethargy. He missed about as many school days as he attended. And we never did figure out what was wrong with him. But the following year, having mastered 8th grade math, I was very clear about the fact that he was ready to do algebra. And I tried all kinds of ways to get him into an algebra class, and I had several encounters. I'll mention one of them. Went to a junior high school. The high schools in the area we were then, and this was just before we moved to Santa Cruz County. The high schools all said, well, their classes were just way too full. They couldn't possibly let my son sit in on an algebra class. But I found a junior high school, now called middle schools, but they were junior high school back then, that was teaching algebra. And my son and I went to talk to the principal, and as soon as he understood what we were asking, his dismissive only comment was, all parents overestimate their kids. And that was that. Shortly after that, we moved to Santa Cruz County. With great trepidation, I went down to the community college and enrolled him as an auditor. I didn't enroll him. You audited a algebra class at a community college. This was after I had asked the instructor to tutor him, and the tutor actually suggested that he sit in on the class, which I thought was a really crazy idea. But we tried everything else. So my son sat in on the class, did a really sloppy job of the homework, only attended 3 out of the 5 days a week that the class met because we didn't want to totally disrupt every day in elementary school. He had to leave the 5th grade to go attend this class. He slopped through the homework, and I thought it had been a serious mistake. Till he took the final exam and got the 2nd highest grade in the class.
Wow.
So for the rest of the 5th grade and throughout the 6th grade, he continued to audit both math and science classes at the community college. When people found out what he was capable of doing, he was given free rein in the computer center, which at that time, big mainframe computer in an air-conditioned room with punched cards and all that stuff, which is now long past. And he was actually hired as a consultant when he was 12 to help people work out some data. So he went to the community college. He established a very solid record in 3 semesters and an intersession and a summer session. And then he applied to the University of California, Santa Cruz when he was 14. There were absolutely no strings to pull at that. I had to pull some strings to get him into the community college in the first place. But his transfer to UC Santa Cruz was straight ahead, no strings to pull whatsoever. He was fully qualified. He went to the University of California, Santa Cruz when he was 14 as a junior and graduated 2 weeks before his 17th birthday. Went on a few years later to get his PhD. So my son has a bachelor's, he has a PhD, he's working in high tech as a computer scientist, and he never went to high school, never went to junior high school, never went to middle school. He stopped at the 6th grade, and if I made any mistakes, it was in not taking him out of school sooner.
And so that happened before you started Beach High School, afterwards, or that was just kind of in the mixture of it and you saw what's happening with your son? You saw
Okay, well, the sequence of events is way back in the 60s. I did the program with the 13 seniors for their senior year. And then it was several years later, well, actually it was only a couple of years later, when I discovered sort of serendipitously what my son was capable of doing in math. This was when he was 8 years old. He was doing some amazing things all on his own that he figured out by himself. And then 2 years after that, we came to Santa Cruz County and he started sitting on community college classes. And then coincident with his graduation from UC Santa Cruz, which was a few years later, I had an opportunity to start a gifted program at my high school, which I did. And I ran that for 10 years. And that was basically my apprenticeship for what I'm doing now.
How did A.S. Neal and his school Summerhill, or his book Summerhill, how did that affect you?
That was the first radical education book I read. And that was way back in the early 60s. I don't know when it was published, but in the early 60s I read Summerhill. And that led to John Holt, Edgar Friedenberg, Paul Goodman. There was sort of a standard bibliography for alternative education in the 60s, and I read all of it, and I was just totally taken in. And that was actually part of what got me to start the special program at the high school in Southern California with the 13 seniors. And it's just been one thing after another since then.
Absolutely, really inspiring.
Even before I read Summerhill, I was never a total conformist. I never totally bought into the public schools. And the reason I didn't do that, actually the reason I became a teacher in the first place, because I went to a perfectly ordinary public high school, drifted through it for 4 years, hardly ever gave it a second thought, got straight A's except for one B that I got from an English teacher that got into a long dispute with. And it was fair to give me the B. But she and I just didn't get along. Otherwise I got all A's without much effort and went directly to UCLA, and that was an enormous shock. Because they really expected me to learn stuff thoroughly. And when I got to the first set of final exams, I thought, are you kidding me? You're going to give me a 3-hour exam over the entire semester and I'm supposed to know everything? I have never had to do anything like this at all. And my grades weren't great the first semester. UCLA then was on the semester system. They're now on quarters. But I got shaped up and learned how to study real fast. And after second semester, for the second semester I was there, and for the rest of the time I was there, I got decent grades. But it was a shock. It was a huge shock. And because of a term paper I'd written in high school about brain surgery, I went to UCLA thinking I'd go to medical school and be a brain surgeon. But this shock of really being expected to learn things was so great that I decided I wanted to go into education and see what I could accomplish.
So from the beginning you saw some kind of pathway opening up that was necessary for you to pursue to help change some other kids' lives.
Yeah, the very, very first thing that set me on the path that I had been on for my entire adult lifetime was the shock of going to UCLA. And I decided one semester in I was going to go into education.
How about Herndon's book, How to Survive in Your Native Land? What was...
Well, of all of the books I read, I said there was kind of a standard bibliography, and James Herndon was one of the people who wrote several books. I guess several, at least two I know of. And How to Survive in Your Native Land. It's sitting in the bookcase behind me. I have two other copies in the house. I didn't solicit them, but a good friend of mine knows how much I love the book, and he's a former book dealer, and he's now a librarian, and he's come across copies of the book and given me two more of them. But the one I originally bought, I typically don't write in books. I typically don't read books more than once. I typically don't make notes in books. But How to Survive in Your Native Land, James Herndon's book, is I have read and reread and reread and reread. It was always the case. We've talked about my being angry. When I got angry, or when I got depressed, or when I really didn't like something that was going on in school, I could always find a section in that book to read which at least made sense of the situation and very often made me feel better. And the book is underlined, there's notes in the margin, and as I said, I don't think I read it from beginning to end more than once, but I read every section of it over and over and over again. I got it out a few months ago, as a matter of fact.
Yeah, I never heard about it. I have to take a look at it. If you were raising teenagers or young kids today, what would you be doing to ensure they become productive and self-fulfilled adults?
I would give them as much opportunity to make their own choices and choose their own directions as possible. And I would have done that from the very beginning. And obviously with a toddler, with a 5-year-old, you can't give them huge amounts of freedom because they haven't matured enough that they're in a position to take care of themselves. But I would have gradually been adding to my child's life choices and freedom to make choices and freedom to take whatever directions they saw fit, unless I saw that that direction was destructive in some way, in which case I would nudge or push in a different direction. But I think kids can be pretty wise. Actually, I have read recently that the midlife crisis is something of a myth, and the vast majority of people don't have midlife crises. But I had one, and that was in the middle of my 40s. And while I was thinking through some things, I would often hear stuff from kids, from teenagers, and I would think, or I would actually say to them, how come you know that? I'm just learning that in my 40s. But I think kids can be pretty wise if you let them be wise. But you don't let them be wise by making all of their decisions for them. You have to go to school, you have to start at 8 o'clock, you get out at 3:15. This is when you can have a break, this is when you can go to lunch, this is what you have to study, you need to go to college. You can't chew gum unless I say so, you can't go to the bathroom unless I say so. You can't talk to your seatmate or your person sitting across from you unless I say so. And that is not a way for people to learn to make their own choices.
What are self-directed learners and unschoolers? Are they the same?
Well, I have a definition of unschooling that I think is probably different from a lot of people. My definition of unschooling is a situation where a kid is studying whatever he or she wants to study. And if the kid has made a decision to study traditional subjects, same subjects that are in public high school, and is willingly and happily doing that, that to me is unschooling, because you've taken away the compulsion, and the kid has decided to do that. On the other hand, if a kid has decided to do absolutely nothing that has anything to do with the traditional subject, but is nevertheless deeply engaged in productive and fulfilling activities, that's fine too, and that's also unschooling. So to me, the chief thing about unschooling is, well, to me, as I've already said, the chief thing about school is that it's compulsory, and I think that, above all else, is what determines what happens in school. And if you take away the compulsion, then you have taken away the principal piece of schooling, and therefore you are unschooling. And regardless of the choices that are made by the students, traditional, non-traditional, everything in between, it's unschooling. But of course, adults need to make sure that kids understand some things. And that is, if the kid has made a choice that I want to go to a four-year college, then there has to be some kind of traditional subject matter studied in some way, not necessarily in a traditional way. I use U.S. history as an example. I think somebody who tours the country and visits historical sites probably learns as much or more than somebody who reads through a high school history textbook. And one of the books that's sitting on my shelf, we've moved here fairly recently, and my books are nowhere near organized, but somewhere on one of my bookshelves, there's a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me. And it's a dissection of high school U.S. history textbooks. And the author says that U.S. high school history, U.S. history, makes people stupid, because it has to walk down such a narrow path where you have all kinds of political influences deciding on what goes in that textbook, that it can't be a rigorous examination of all aspects of U.S. history, because so many things are out of bounds. Can't do this, can't do that, talk about this, can't talk about that, it's controversial, etc., etc., etc. And he uses the Vietnam War as a prime example. And we now, I think, is a general consensus that the Vietnam War is a mistake. And he said that people who were unschooled in high school about history were smarter about the Vietnam War than people who were. And I've lost track of what your question was and where we're headed.
No, just unschoolers and self-directed learners, if they're the same. How important do you think it is to pursue one's interests?
I think it's extremely important. There's all kinds of actual research being done. I mean, I like to think that what I believe, for the most part, is backed up by research somewhere. And there's an enormous amount of evidence that people become more confident, more productive, more deeply engaged in what they're doing if there's some interest. And I wish I could remember where this came from. Somebody, a significant academic researcher, has said recently the most significant thing that a person needs is to have a purpose. To believe that what you're doing with your life results in something that matters to you. You have a purpose. And I deeply believe that.
Based on my research, it seems that self-directed learning, unschooling, is the future of education. One of the challenges is parents say, oh, they're just going to do what they want to do, and a lot of it is maybe video games.
Right.
Have your students had these challenges, or parents, or what would you speak to parents who are concerned about their kids playing Minecraft or playing whatever game for hours, and is there learning value in that, or how would you advise parents in that way?
Well, I've graduated almost 1,500 people from my school, and the issue for the people I worked with has never arisen. So I haven't had a whole lot of time to think it through. I know a woman that I respect a great deal believes that there's no harm at all in playing video games to whatever extent kids want to do it. And there is research that shows that playing video games develops certain kinds of skills. My favorite little story, I mean this is an anecdote, doesn't prove much of anything, but when there was the gigantic oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, I heard a comment on the news that the people who were best at operating the remote machinery that was deep under the surface of the ocean trying to work on what was causing the leak, the people who were really good at that were the people who had a lot of experience playing video games. So there's an occupational advantage in that particular case of playing video games. And as a matter of fact, the university here in the county, UC Santa Cruz, now has a major in gaming and in developing video games. So it has become a respectable, well, in some quarters at least, a respectable academic subject.
Yeah, with smartphones, you're able to play games on your phones, and so
Right.
there's this platform where there's a need
Right.
for nice new types
Right.
of games.
Well, but then of course there's also, and I don't know where I come down on this, but as you know, there's an awful lot of concern these days that people are spending way too much time staring at screens and not doing other things, including talking face-to-face with people like I'm talking face-to-face with you right now.
Your motto at Beach High School, from your emblem or your seals, to be rather to seem. What does that mean to you, or what inspired you to use that as your motto?
What inspired me to use that, where that came from, was when I was still teaching in a public high school and running my gifted program. I decided, I'm not sure why, that we needed some kind of a motto. So I went down to the library. I thought it would be really impressive if it were Latin. So I went down to the school's library and I got a Latin phrase book, and I found that rather quickly, and I thought that, well, that's really cool. So that became our motto. And I discovered years later, fairly recently actually, that it's the state motto of North Carolina. And what it means to me is, don't be a fake, be real. You know, don't seem to people the way you want to be seen by them, but be who you are. Just be.
Love it. What is your opinion of grades in public schools, and how does grading work at Beach High School?
Well, one of the subjects I taught in public high school was chemistry. And I know for a fact that there were people in my classes, and this may be some reflection on me as a teacher, that there were people who had a deep understanding of chemistry when they left that class and they got an A. And I'm sure that there were other people who had a very superficial understanding of chemistry, but in fact had learned to manipulate symbols that they didn't really understand in order to solve problems, and left class knowing not much chemistry and forgetting very promptly what they did learn. And they also got A's because they learned how to manipulate things. And I had the same experience, and this is a long story which I won't go into, but I had to get through a final exam at UCLA after having not attended the class all semester because I was enrolled in another school and doing my student teaching at the same time that this class was meeting. So I couldn't attend the class. And it was do or die in passing the final exam. And I have a really, well, it's not as good as it used to be, but I used to have a pretty good photographic memory. And I sat down over Christmas vacation the last semester that I was at UCLA. I went there for 4.5 years, and I was there for the fall semester for my last semester, and that encompassed Christmas vacation. So I went home at Christmas, I holed up in my bedroom, and I memorized 100 and some pages of a physics textbook. I mean, I could actually read the textbook in my mind. It was an open book test for me. So I went to the final. I would look at a question, I would thumb through the book in my mind until I came to some equations that contained similar symbols to the ones that were on the test question. And so I would manipulate symbols until I came up with something that I thought was a good answer. And I passed the class. And I learned nothing. In that class, I learned nothing. I learned how to manipulate the symbols that were associated with the ideas that were supposed to be presented in this physics class, but I didn't learn the physics. And I'm sure, and I'm not proud of that. But it saved me a year of graduate school because I was simultaneously doing my student teaching. And I'm sure there are kids who go through all their subjects, many of their subjects. I mean, I've talked to kids who've gone through 4 years of high school English and submitted lots of book reports, and they've never read a book. You know, they faked it. They got Cliff Notes, or they talked to friends, or they even copied somebody else's book report, or they read the book jacket, or whatever. And I know that there were people who went through my chemistry class and learned not much, just as I learned not much in that physics class, and got an A, because they could answer the questions. They could pass the tests.
So what is the way to evaluate learning or achievement in your view?
What I do now is I ask kids to evaluate themselves. As a matter of fact, I did that in the public high school. I gave up teaching chemistry because I thought it was doing more harm than good. I got tired of going to parties and introducing myself to strangers. And of course, one of the first questions that come up is, well, what kind of work do you do? Well, I'm a chemistry teacher. Well, and as soon as I said that, very often the reaction was fear in people's eyes, and they would back away and they would say things like, I never understood chemistry. I never understood what a mole was. And I felt that I was doing that to my students. What I would have loved to have done at some point in time is to teach chemistry, to teach the chemistry that I think most people might have a use for in their lives who were not going to be scientists, and teach the basic ideas, forget all the technical details that somebody's preparing to be a chemist or a physicist or a doctor needs, and teach people just the basic conceptual ideas in physics, in chemistry, that they might actually use in their lifetimes. And I could do it in a few hours. It doesn't take a year-long course with lots and lots of technical detail and some math and some quantitative reasoning. There's nothing wrong with quantitative reasoning, but the amount that people need to do in their lives isn't at a high level. And there's no need for most people to pass through a year-long course in high school chemistry. It is essentially pre-professional training. And for somebody who's going to study history or art or dance in college, what's the point? And I didn't want to create people who years hence would still feel embarrassed or worse because they never understood what a mole was. It's a tricky concept. It's hard for me to understand why for people it's so tricky, but it is.
Many of your students go on to universities, trade schools, professions without traditional diplomas or transcripts. How is that possible?
The vast majority of them go to a community college first. And well, it depends on the state. I mean, as you can imagine, most of my students are in California. If they're in a different state, I have to find out what their deal is in that state regarding admissions to community colleges, and what I do doesn't work in some states. But in California, if a student says, I want to start at a community college, I make it clear to them that if they want to go to a four-year school, they're going to have to stay there a while. If they want to go on to a four-year school from the community college, they need to establish a solid, somewhat lengthy record at the community college, which will be the basis for their transferring to a four-year school, and will have nothing to do, in most cases, with what they've done in high school. So what I do for people who want to go to a community college is write a narrative transcript. No grades, no course titles, no credits, no GPA, no test scores, just a narrative. And the narrative comes from an essay that the students write for me and a support letter they get from someone who knows them well. And I take excerpts of the whole things and put them together and create a narrative, and at the end of the narrative it says, this person, because of the reasons described above, graduated from high school on such and such a date. And that gets people into California community colleges. And then they build a record, and then they go into four-year schools based only on the record at the community college. So the narrative transcripts are what the vast majority of my students get, and most of them are not in a position to go directly to a four-year school because they've skipped half or more of high school. So they haven't done the subject matter requirements that are necessary to get directly into a four-year school. Those they do in a community college, and those requirements are very different. University of California, of course, is most familiar to me, and there's several required subjects that you have to do in high school if you want to go directly to a four-year school. You want to go directly to the University of California. But if you go to University of California as a junior transfer student, which is about the only way you can do it, you have to be a junior, the requirements are completely different. They're much more minimal, and they are much more flexible. And so if you do what you need to do to get to a four-year campus, and I also want to say that UC is one of the most demanding institutions to transfer into. And many schools can be transferred into after a year at a community college without regard to one's high school record. But the University of California, it's typically 2 years, or a full 2 years, however long that takes. I mean, it might make somebody 3 or 4 years to do a full 2 years of work.
So the idea is to get into the community college and then establish some record there, and then use the community
Right.
college record to get into UC or any other type of university or
Right.
trade.
Exactly.
Is it the trades are similar also?
Yeah, they are. The young man I mentioned earlier, who's going into HVAC work and services our furnace, he has a narrative transcript. It got him into his union and his apprenticeship. I have a very much smaller group of people who go straight to a four-year school. And for those people, first of all, they have to have done some traditional subjects in some way or other. And for those people, I write a completely different kind of transcript. It's much more traditional. It does have course titles, grades, credits, GPA, test scores. What's different about the transcripts I write is that, especially if they have done a lot of work entirely on their own, I write or they write typically, detailed course descriptions of what they've done. The resources they've used, the content they covered, and what they did. Did they write essays? Did they do experiments? Did they go on field trips? What did they do? And these transcripts turn out to be 15 pages maybe. And I feel that if someone has done a lot of important and impressive work, but done it outside of recognized institutions, then a lot of detail has to be included to make it convincing to college admissions people. And then what helps a lot is if that person has taken a community college class or two, or maybe 6 or even more, to demonstrate that he can function in an academic setting. And also high test scores help a lot. So typically I have a student who has high test scores or community college work or both, and a very detailed transcript describing all independent work and exactly what was done. And that works. I mean, I've had kids go to Stanford, NYU, all kinds of places.
Straight from Beach High School
Yes.
to Stanford and NYU.
Yes, and a long list of other places.
So in places that either don't accept the transcripts or diplomas, you said sometimes it doesn't work in some states.
Right.
How do you deal with students there, or is there just they don't?
No, sometimes I don't. I have found New York to be extremely difficult. Kids are really boxed in New York State. And I've had 2 or 3 conversations with people who say, my kid is 15, wants to go to a community college, and I haven't been able to find a way for them to do that. So every once in a while I have to turn somebody down. On the other hand, there are some states that are very much like California. I just talked to a community college in Washington. Obviously I didn't talk to the community college, I talked to a person at the community college. And I was informed that Washington State is like California. If you're 18, you can just go free and clear, and they will accept my diplomas and my transcripts. Typically it's the transcript that's submitted.
So in your book you do talk about some of the transcripts and you give examples. Any key best practices you recommend for other people doing a private school like you've done, or
Mhm.
other best practices for transcripts?
Well, I will give talk this July at the Homeschool Association of California's conference, and I've been doing the talks for many years. And many of those years I've given a talk on writing transcripts. And the first thing I tell people is there are two basic principles. Number one is there is no standard format. You devise an easy to understand format that best presents what your kid has done, whatever that looks like, and it need not be traditional. And the second thing I say is that if your kid has done a lot of work in recognized institutions, like one of my students who did go to NYU, did a lot of work at the local community college as a high school student. And he also had quite decent, he didn't have astronomical, but he had quite decent test scores. And he also conducted himself extremely well during an interview. And he wanted to study theater, and he was already on the payroll of the drama department at the local community college. So he had all kinds of things to recommend him. And he had a long list of community college courses. Actually, a majority of the work he'd done was at a community college. So this is an accepted institution. He'd proven himself as a college student, so I didn't feel it was necessary to write a detailed transcript for him at all. But on the other hand, I've had kids who've done almost everything at home independently, and those people need very detailed transcripts to make them convincing. So that's the second basic principle. There's an inverse relationship between how much work you've done at a recognized institution and how much detail you need to include on the transcript. Lots of detail if a lot of work has been done at home independently, or not necessarily actually at home, but outside of recognized institutions.
So when you say detail, you mean the specifics of their projects, their achievements, the starting the process, the end of it, the wrap up, some of the real detailed parts of it. So that's
You mentioned projects, and what I typically do is I will take a project and I will give it a course title and a grade and credit, and then after the list of courses, grades, and credits comes a list of course descriptions. So the project would be described in some detail in a solid paragraph as a course description. And occasionally I've used other things. I've used reading lists. If somebody's read an extensive and impressive set of books, I'll include a reading list. Sometimes I've included as part of a transcript letters of recommendation for people. My feeling is anything that supports the validity of what somebody has done and is convincing to admissions officials, as long as it can be put in writing, or maybe even I've included photographs on transcripts. If it can somehow be put down on paper in a convincing way, then it's fair game.
Mind if we shift these blinds here, or shift them a little bit? Just making
Better?
perfect. Yeah, I think that's good.
How are we doing?
Doing great. Doing really great. You mentioned online correspondence or online/correspondence courses,
Right.
and so this seems to be very attractive with the internet and people having access to these open courseware that you mentioned, or massive online open courses.
Right.
What should parents know about that? What should students know about that? How do you see them being used in the future?
I would be reluctant. I mean, those kinds of things, especially MOOCs, massive open online courses, are somewhat controversial. And the first thing I would say is don't do everything that way. But I don't think there's any problem whatsoever of doing part of your college preparation, if that's what you're doing, using MOOCs or online coursework or online resources like MIT's OpenCourseWare or anything along those lines. I think correspondence course is pretty much a term of the past. It used to be that people would write out lessons on sheets of paper and mail them in and get them back graded, but that doesn't happen much anymore, if at all. I mean, it's pretty much online these days. But I don't see any problem whatsoever in using online or distance learning resources, but I wouldn't recommend that somebody do everything that way.
Do you have any recommendations for people that are doing homeschooling, they want to get in the community, build the social aspect of their
Sure.
being?
There are lots and lots, yeah, I mean, this is kind of a bugaboo in homeschooling about, what about socialization? And my first response to that is, what about the socialization in a public high school? One woman whose name escapes me wrote a book many years ago called Reviving Ophelia. Can't remember the woman's name. I saw an interview with her once where she described the atmosphere in a typical public high school as toxic. And I've had many kids tell me that they're just driven crazy by what everybody talks about. You know, the next party, the next drinking binge, the next sexual encounter, you know, mean girls and mean boys, for that matter. There's just a lot of stuff that goes on at high school that is not healthy socialization. And I'm not advocating coming home and isolating yourself in your kitchen or your bedroom, but the homeschoolers that I've known don't do that. They're out in the community meeting people of all ages, not just people their same age. And there are a lot of areas where there are homeschool co-ops and there are park days and there are all kinds of ways. I mean, HSC, the Homeschooling Association of California, sponsors camping trips, for example. They have representatives in almost every county in California. And there are local and statewide organizations that sponsor all kinds of activities where people can go and meet other kids. And of course, online, you can go to the Not Back to School camp, for example, and I don't know how long it lasts, but say it lasts 10 days. You go there and spend 10 days there, and you come home and you've made some contacts, and you can keep in touch with those people through Skype and email and Twitter and all the rest of it. And in that way, I think social media is a really good thing. I mean, I have a really close friend, and I've known her for, I've known her for 17 years. I've actually spent no more than 10 days with her in 4 different states on 5 different occasions. But she's a really close friend and we keep in touch by email. So there's all kinds of ways to meet people. And it is true that the majority of teens are in high school. But I think there are some problems caused by that. I mean, it's an age ghetto is the way I've heard it described. I mean, everybody's the same age, and where else in life are you going to always be with people who are all the same age? As a matter of fact, many of the kids who come to me and say they want to work with me in one way or another for one reason or another already are hanging out with older people. They prefer the company of older people. They prefer to hang out with adults. So I don't see any merit in putting kids in a situation where they're interacting almost entirely with people their own age.
Have you had any students who wanted to graduate early or be a part of Beach High School and still play sports?
That has never been much of an issue, no. No, I have never had to grapple with that issue.
I've heard, maybe you can correct me, that if a family is homeschooling and they don't have the sports availability or accessibility in their homeschool, then whatever schools in their district, they have an opportunity to go either try out for the team or be involved somehow. Have you heard anything like this at your
Yes, that
travels?
depends entirely on the school district you live in. I mean, some schools are really hostile toward homeschooling, and you will get no cooperation from them whatsoever. At the other end of the spectrum, there are schools that do cooperate with homeschoolers, and they will let people participate, maybe even take classes and participate in athletic teams and so on. And I know there are some league rules that cover that, but I don't know what they are, because amazingly enough, in the hundreds and hundreds of kids I've dealt with, there hasn't been a big issue. I mean, my kids go on, my kids go on and typically at a community college, and there they can participate in sports just like anybody else.
So if they had interest, they could hone their skills and play at the community
Right.
college level,
Right.
or intramurals if they needed to,
Right.
and meet some people
You
there.
know, and conceivably, size and age would be issues. I mean, I've had people as young as 13 start at community colleges. My son did when he was 10, but that's a rare exception. I've only had one other 10-year-old. But it's not unheard of for me to be working with a 13-year-old. You know, and a 13-year-old undoubtedly is not as physically mature as an 18-year-old or somebody older at a community college, so there is a disadvantage in that regard. But by the time kids are 14 or 15 or 16, they can, in many sports, compete right along with older people at community colleges.
There's a bill that's passed in California that's now mandating vaccines for kids. Have you seen this increase the people calling you for your support in Beach High School, or what is your view on that? How do you think that'll turn out in the next year or two in response from parents?
Well, my personal opinion is that vaccines are essential for public health. And I think a lot of the anti-vaccine rhetoric is mistaken. But it's not an issue I have to deal with. The Homeschooling Association of California, which I've mentioned several times and with which I've been affiliated for a long time, I've served on its board. I'm currently its teen advisor. I speak at their conferences. They have a team of attorneys that work for the organization and with homeschoolers. And their judgment is that the mandated vaccines that a kid has to have had to go to school do not apply to a situation like mine, because we're sitting in my school, it's a single room, I don't have anybody coming in here on a regular basis, I never have groups here. And under those conditions, and under the same conditions when families are doing their own homeschooling, the mandatory vaccine law does not apply. So I don't have to deal with it.
Graduating 1,500 students is quite impressive, and you must have seen a lot of unique scenarios and situations. Have you made any conclusions about human potential, human nature, anything that you can kind of refine down from what you've seen in all these unique situations? And many of your students have, really productive and successful adult lives.
There is a psychologist named Anders Ericsson at Florida State University whose work has been misinterpreted in a number of ways, but who has done a lot of research with musicians and mathematicians and other groups of people, who says that on average, I mean it's not a hard and fast number, but on average, to really master a skill, I mean to be a world-class musician, for example, requires 10,000 hours of practice. And it does not just any old practice will do, it's what he deliberate practice. As a matter of fact, he has a brand new book out, the title is Peak, P-E-A-K. And his name is Anders Ericsson, E-R-I-C-S-S-O-N. And he also makes the very interesting claim that nobody, not Albert Einstein, not anybody, has any kind of innate advantage when it comes to whatever kind of skill we're talking about, mathematics or music or whatever. He does say that there are a few instances where genetics matter, as in height for basketball players. You know, if you're 4'5", you're not going to be an NBA player. And body build, you need to be bulky to play football in most positions. But aside from a few limited instances like that, he says nobody has any kind of innate advantage at anything. It's a matter of practice, and it's a matter of deliberate practice. And deliberate practice does not mean playing the same piece on the piano over and over and over again and making the same mistakes every time. What it means is playing the piece, notice where you're making mistakes, figuring out how to fix those mistakes, and getting better at where you're weak. That's deliberate practice. And he says it takes 10,000 hours of deliberate practice to really be a master of anything. And it's not based on innate talent. Now that's kind of an extreme view, but that's his view. And he has very convincing arguments, and I am convinced that there's a lot of untapped human potential precisely because we put people in these compulsory boxes where the same messages come to everybody. You got to study this, you got to study that, you got to study this set of subjects, you got to go to college, etc., etc. And if you are in high school and your passion is music, your passion is dance, you want to build houses, whatever, there's lots and lots of things you can name that are not supported in high school. And so this takes away people's ability to deeply engage in what they're deeply interested in. And so I believe that many, many people are capable of doing much more than they are typically allowed to do.
And for people who have not found their passion, whether adults or let's say teenagers, 12 to 16, how would you suggest that these teens find their passions, or adults?
I have no recipe for finding one's passion. I absolutely love, I mean, you've read my books, you know there's lots of stories in there, and many of those stories are of students I've worked with, but other stories are of people that I've just met, and they have agreed to tell me their story. For example, there's an emergency room doctor that I met when I had kidney stones, and when he had a few minutes, I asked him to tell me a little bit about his story. He was quite willing to give me his phone number and follow up and tell me his complete story, and it's in my more recent book. So whether I've had people as students, whether I meet them on the street, and we get into a conversation, and I've had a lot of opportunity to pick people's brains about how they got into the work that they're doing, how they found their passion. And a theme that runs through this, and it's not universally true, but it shows up an awful lot, and that is people are living engaged lives. They're engaged in something. They're living their lives. And without being able to predict what's going to happen, without being able to predict when it's going to happen, they run into something, they encounter something. It's an article, or it's a movie, or it's a book, or it's another person, or it's a situation, or an event, or it's a site that they visit, or something. And there's just an instant recognition, okay, this is it. I mean, it's like me, I went to UCLA, boom, whoa, this is what it really means to learn stuff. I'm going to devote my life to helping people learn stuff. My favorite story, my all-time favorite story, is a young woman who was in my gifted program when I was still teaching in a public high school. She wanted to take the proficiency exam, which we mentioned, and move on, go to college, but her parents thought that was really scary. They didn't want her to do it, so she didn't. She went through high school, she graduated, and I knew nothing about what happened to her until a few years later she called me up, and we set up a date for breakfast to get caught up. And during the course of that conversation, I learned that she had just been accepted into a PhD program into the physiology of people at high altitudes. And I thought, whoa, you know, that is a really narrow, interesting, unusual field to go into. Where did that come from? And she looked at me instantly, without hesitation, and quite sincerely said, I watched the movie Top Gun. And so, here's a young woman who goes to see a movie. I'm sure she did not buy her ticket as career guidance, but she went into the movie, she watched the film, she saw these guys flying around in these fast airplanes at high altitudes, and thought, whoa, some interesting things might happen to people when they're under those conditions. And she went on and got a PhD. She went to work for the Navy. And I always get a laugh when I say this in talks. They assigned her to submarines. But when you stop and think about it, people in submarines are operating under different conditions of pressure and temperature, just like people at high altitude. So in that way, it's similar. And so she has been working in the Navy doing research on people who are aboard submarines.
You mentioned the compulsory nature of schooling, and this also appears to me to be the root cause of all these pathologies and a lot of problems. What do you think are the long-term effects of compulsory schooling on the young mind, let's say for 12 years? Does that come out later in life, or do people have to deal with that? What do you think happens to them in your experience?
I am really wary of generalizations about, well, this happens to people, and so therefore 10 years later this happens. I mean, people are different. And I am absolutely not going to deny that some kids go to high school, they find it a wonderful experience, socially, academically, however, athletically, and they profit from it. I am not denying that some people profit from high school. But I think when they do, it's an accident. I don't think it's because somebody has carefully figured out what's good for that kid. I think it's just that the high school program and the kid just happened to be a good fit. I think there also happens to be a lot of bad fits for people. And if it's a bad fit, I think all kinds of things can happen. I mean, I think a kid can just struggle through and come out of it and put it behind him and be fine. I think some people can get kind of quashed by it and lose confidence, lose a sense of their authentic selves, and maybe then, because of the pressure they've gotten, maybe not only from school but from parents and society in general, they go to law school and hate being lawyers, just because that seemed to be the narrow path that the whole society, including compulsory education, was fitting them into. I think some people, while they're in high school, it has struck me that high school is a culture. And I remember many, many years ago, a kid brought me a magazine that had in it some photographs of some absolutely amazing graffiti. And generally I hate graffiti because I think it's destruction of public property. Nobody has a right to go paint on a public wall or somebody's private wall just because they feel like it. But I would have to admit that in this particular case, the graffiti was amazing. It was absolutely amazing artwork. And it just dawned on me, as a result of looking at that photograph, that this kid and that graffiti in that magazine represents a whole different culture. And what kids have done is they go to school and they find the culture doesn't work for them. And so they invent their own cultures. Unfortunately, because nobody is offering them significant alternatives, everybody says you got to go to high school. It's absolutely essential. You can't make it in life without a high school diploma. I actually heard on the news just a couple of weeks ago a superintendent of a local district saying you cannot have a real career without a college degree. And that's just total bunk. It's a false statement, but people believe it. And they also believe that, well, if I'm going to get that college degree, then I have to go to high school. That's not true either. But that's the common myth. And so people go on these situations, or they find themselves in this situation, but it doesn't really work, and it makes some people feel really burdened, really oppressed, and so they create alternative cultures, and because nobody is offering them positive alternatives, they create sometimes some pretty destructive cultures that have in them drugs, promiscuous sex, alcohol, done to extremes, and so on. So, you become a part of the drug culture because nobody's offered you a good one. So I think the long-term effects for people who feel that high school is a bad fit can play out in all kinds of ways. And it depends on the temperament and the previous experiences of the person involved.
Do you think the future of schooling will involve compulsory attendance, or you think in the next few years, 5, 10, 15, 20, 50 years, people will begin to awaken to the damage compulsory schooling attendance does to the learning process?
I really honestly don't know. I think schooling is going in the wrong direction because it is becoming narrower and narrower and narrower and higher pressure. Some kids are getting sick. There's a book called Doing School by a woman named Denise Pope, who's affiliated with Stanford. She's got a newer book out, the title of which I don't remember. But the whole thesis of Doing School is that a lot of kids are just going through the motions, but they're feeling a huge amount of pressure, and it's making them sick, physically sick, like my son was made physically sick. Not in his case, it wasn't because of pressure, it was because of boredom. And by the way, I don't think I mentioned way back when that as soon as he started sitting in on community college classes, his illness disappeared. And I am completely convinced he was bored sick in school. Literally bored sick, where he was physically ill. So Denise Pope makes the case in her book that the pressure of schools is not healthy. People get ulcers, people don't get enough sleep, and so on and so on.
I love the idea that you promote freedom for self-direction. I feel myself that is the future of learning, so that's what I'm working towards.
Right.
The other side of freedom is responsibility. And it seems in compulsory schooling, the other side would be if you're given freedom, if we're not going to compel you to do something, then you would need some kind of self-discipline to pursue and persist. Any insights on developing self-discipline for teens that want to move forward, but they have some maybe old habits or tendencies? How do they grow self-discipline?
Well, can I back up and go on and really, I haven't answered your question yet about the future of schooling, and I really honestly don't know. I don't know what the future of this country is. I mean, with the state of politics, stuff that's going on right now, I'm pretty pessimistic about the future of this country, not just education, but every aspect of society in this country, and I don't know what's going to happen. I hate to give you I don't know answer, but I really don't. And in terms of a sense of responsibility, I think it just requires some gentle guidance. I mean, there's a pretty common idea that if somebody has gone to public school for a while and then jumps into homeschooling, there's a period of decompression. There's a period of adjustment. Because kids are so used to being told what to do, they are so accustomed to waking up in the morning and going to school and doing exactly what they're told. It takes a while to get their heads swung around to the point where they understand that they're in charge. Way back when, at the same school where I had that group of 13 people, I was sitting in a circle talking to a different group of people. And this was a non-college prep science class, so I could be pretty free about content in this class. And I was trying to find out what people were interested in so we could have, we could go in that direction and pursue people's interests, as long as it was science. And one kid made a comment I will never, ever, ever forget. He said, "Wes, we have been in school so long, we don't know what we're interested in."
And what did you feel when he said that?
A really sinking feeling, and as I said, I mean, that comment just bore into me, and I'll never forget it. And that was 45 years ago.
Do you have a view on Common Core curriculum?
I hate it.
Why?
Because it's so standardized. I don't know why this came up. I guess maybe it was because of this comment the local superintendent made about you got to go to college to have a real career. I got a brochure from the National Association of Educational Progress, which was reported on in the news recently that scores in reading and math have dropped a little bit in the last testing round, which was last year. And I got a question, a math question for 12th graders off of the brochure for the National Assessment of Educational Progress. I'm not sure I said it right the first time. And it was this complex question about functions, which I couldn't answer. I mean, I've taught algebra. It's been a long time. And it has been a sufficiently long time that I can't answer this question. And there's no reason in my life why I should be able to. And I read another book recently by a professor at the City University of New York who called The Math Myth and Other STEM Delusions. And it's an argument that maybe 5% of the people who will go through the whole high school math curriculum, which is typically 3 years, 2 years of algebra and a year of geometry, about 5% of people actually use that stuff. And for the rest of the people, it's kind of useless. And so I've made a handout for the HSC conference coming up in July where I include that equation and then ask a bunch of questions about it. Can you answer this question? Is it important that you are or not able to answer this question? Do you have a use for answering this question in your life? And then I have a quote above about becoming one's boldest self. And I said, would answering this question help make you your boldest self? And of course I think all of the answers to those questions are no. For the vast majority of people, I have no need for this. And I think that's, I mean, the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, is supposed to be a major measurement of college readiness, and it's aligned with Common Core. And I think Common Core is the same deal. It's a bunch of standard stuff that everybody is supposed to learn. And I think one of the huge ironies is that half a mile in that direction is this high school where I taught for 20 years. And the vast majority of the people who were teaching in that school could not answer the math questions on the 12th grade Common Core curriculum. And if the people who are running the institution, who maintain that all this stuff is necessary, don't know it themselves, how ironic is that?
I want to ask you about that. Is it okay if I shut this a little bit more?
Sure.
The lights?
Yeah. The sun goes down and more and more comes in. Give it a good crank.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure your shirt and your face were in there well. Still, you have something right there. Is it okay if I just turn all the way?
Yeah, sure.
So, as much as possible.
Yeah, I don't think you're ever going to get...
100%. Can I turn the other way?
Yeah, I'm not sure that's better. I'll give it a shot.
Well, let's see. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that's as good, actually.
No, it's not. There's just like this little beam of light that's coming in.
Yeah, well,
Going off your face.
back up and get out of it, maybe?
Okay. Yeah, that'll work, I think. Oh, perfect. Yeah, there's no sun on you there. Okay.
Great.
You mentioned the Common Core and your distaste for it. I also hate it. What do you think the intentions are behind the state, or in fact the federal government, in bringing out Common Core standards? Why would they bring this out?
I think the people in power want to maintain the status quo so they can retain their power. And I also think they figure, well, I arrived in life at this powerful position the way I did, so everybody else should try to do it that way too. I mean, I think it's just that simple.
And what role do you think financial interests play in the schools? Did you ever see the budgets or the publishing contracts, or
Right.
is there a lot of money from these book publishers that make these new textbooks, in your view?
Sure. A guy named Theodore Sizer, who was, I think, an academic at Brown University at the time he wrote the books I'm about to mention. I don't know where he is now. I'm not even sure he's still alive. But Theodore Sizer wrote a book called Horace's Compromise. And I remember one sentence from that book. I mean, I remember the overall sense of the book, but I remember one sentence in particular. And he said, the public schools are never going to reform themselves because they are too entrenched, they are too big, and they are too mindless. And I think the big and the entrenched parts have to do with not just the schools, but the test makers, the textbook publishers, and everybody else who makes money from providing materials for schools. I mean, you'd be amazed at, or maybe you wouldn't be, but people who don't know me and don't know the work I do, they see Beach High School and they assume that it's a traditional high school, and there's a high school campus here, there's a football field, there's classrooms, there's a cafeteria, and all the rest of it. And I get piles and piles and piles and piles of mail from catalogs. I get big, thick, glossy catalogs. For example, one I got just a day or two ago, I could go in our recycling bin and pull it out, was a catalog of repair parts for various things that a school would have on its campus. And I get thick, glossy catalogs for cheerleader outfits, and I get catalogs for portable classrooms, and on and on and on and on, none of which I need, of course. And I really feel guilty, but I don't know how to get off these lists. I mean, they're not stuff that's addressed to the resident of, they're addressed to Beach High School. They're sometimes addressed to me personally. West Beach, Director, Beach High School. And I get piles and piles and piles of this stuff, and these are all people, of course, who are manufacturing goods of various kinds that they sell to schools. So if the school enterprise were to collapse, it would not just be the schools. It would be the textbook publishers, the test makers, the makers of doormats, the makers of picnic tables, the makers of this and that, and projector bulbs. I'm getting whole catalogs of projector bulbs. It's amazing.
I believe it was in 2010, the government in California was trying to pass something that would require homeschooling parents to have teaching credentials.
Right.
And then so that kind of angered the parents, the homeschooling community, and they rose up and they fought it. Do you think the state will try to do that again in California, or do you think it's too far gone, the population of homeschoolers is too large for them to do that? Or what do you think the future of the homeschooling laws are in California?
Well, I have mentioned several times in our conversation about the Homeschooling Association of California, and I have enormous respect for this organization. I was on the board for 2 years, and being on the board meant that every quarter I went somewhere in California. I mean, I've been in Sacramento, I've been in Davis, I've been in the desert in Southern California. The board meetings were always at someone's home. And basically this is a group of people, all volunteers, sitting around somebody's kitchen table having a quarterly board meeting. And this organization has been able to accomplish an enormous amount. I mean, it puts on the yearly conference that I mentioned that draws about 1,000 people from all over the country. I mean, most of them are from California, but they come from all over the country. They publish a magazine, which is now an online magazine. It used to be a print magazine. They publish brochures. They have people in almost every county that are there to advise homeschoolers, and they have had a significant influence on law in California, all by a bunch of volunteers who feel passionately. I mean, we were talking about finding one's passion. These are people who are passionate about homeschooling because they've seen what it can accomplish. And so, but again, in terms of predicting the future, I have no idea. I mean, I hate to get gloomy, but a few years ago I read that if a terrorist gets a hold of a nuclear weapon and sets it off in New York City, this is the end of our country. So I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen to our country and to the world and the state that it's in.
How many homeschoolers would you estimate are in California and or nationwide? Do you have any of these?
I'm sorry, those statistics exist, but I don't have them at the top of my head.
I saw some statistics, I think it was over 10 years ago, saying about 2.5 million homeschoolers nationwide. And I was going to ask you, naturally the state, whether it's the California or the federal state, they have interest in showing smaller numbers.
Right.
So just in terms of the numbers, do you see a growing increase of homeschooling families at these conventions? You're speaking, you see a lot. Do you see the population growing and getting more strength?
I think the conference has been pretty steady for the last several years in terms of numbers of people there. And I quite honestly, again, I don't have, I mean, I know the statistics exist. I suspect that homeschooling is growing, but I'm not sure. I'm also sure, what I am sure of, is that there are some uncounted homeschoolers, because some people just want to be completely under the radar, and they don't want to do the minimal legal work they have to do to be officially homeschoolers. And actually in California, there's no such thing legally as homeschooling. There's nothing in the education code that mentions homeschooling. People have 2 or 3 options. One is they can set up themselves in the same way that I have as a private school. So people who are homeschooling, and actually the advice is, if you're talking to a school official, don't ever say homeschooling. Say that your kid is going to a private school if you're doing it independently. And there are also public schools that support homeschoolers. That's another way of doing it. So all the legalities are taken care of by the school, and you just send your kid there. And you don't have to worry about transcripts or grades or anything of the sort, or the legalities of it. And there's a third way that says that, setting up a private school does not require you to be a credentialed teacher. I think the law says you have to be capable of instructing your kids. And the argument that HSE has put forward is, nobody knows my kid better than I do, so I'm in a really good position to provide instruction to my kid. But the third option does require a teaching credential. If you have a teaching credential, or if you hire a credentialed teacher, then you can get out from under compulsory education by having your kid tutored. And there are some restrictions there that don't apply to the private school option. But if you have hired a tutor, or you yourself are a credentialed teacher, for 175 days of the year for, I forget how many number of hours of a day, if you provide instruction, then you're legal.
How important is it that students adjust their relationship with failure? In schools we have A, B, C,
Right.
D, failure, and if you get this failure grade they feel really bad.
Right.
But in studying achievers, failure is actually really positive. Do you have
Right.
any view on failure in your experience with your students, or just in your own personal life?
In my own personal life? Well, I am certainly not going to tell you that I have never failed at anything. I failed to continue as a public school teacher, for example. And I have failed to accomplish some things in connection with bureaucracy and so on. And for me, it's just a matter of, well, okay, that's the best I can do, so we move on from there. And I know there's a lot of research being done about how important it is to be able to face failure and to recover from it and move on. And failure can be a very important way of learning things. You know, I tried this and it didn't work, so I learned something. Long time ago, I heard somebody comment about a statement that, well, I conducted this experiment and it failed. No, there's no such thing as a failed experiment. You tried something, and what you learned is things don't work that way. You learned something. It didn't work that way. And I can say the same thing about any kind of failure, not just a scientific experiment. You try something, it doesn't work, well, you figure out that it doesn't work that way, so you try something else. As far as my students are concerned, some of them have actually gotten in legal trouble. The very first one I remember was I heard secondhand that shortly after I had given a diploma to a kid who was already an accomplished draftsman and wanted to go to community college and hone those skills, shortly after I graduated him, he wound up in a locked-up rehab center because he was addicted to drugs. So as soon as I found that out, I called up his mom and I said, do you think it was a mistake to take him out of the structured environment of school? Would he have been better off? And she immediately said, absolutely not, we should have taken him out sooner. which is sort of off the topic, but I think, well, let me use my granddaughter as an example, and I do this with her permission, although I'm not going to name her. My granddaughter really ran off the rails when she was a teenager, and this continued into her early 20s. And I will leave it up to you to imagine what running off the rails means, but she really ran off the rails. And there were years when I had very serious doubts that my granddaughter was ever going to do anything productive in life, maybe even never even be self-supporting. Well, she had a child. About a year later, she married the child's father. And it is my opinion, although I would never recommend this as a cure for anybody, I would never say, well, your daughter's off track, let her have a kid. And that's really bad advice. But in my granddaughter's case, it's what turned her around. She had a kid, she married the kid's father, she moved from California to Indiana where her parents had taken up residence. She went to a community college after failing a whole bunch of coursework here in California at a community college. She did really well there. She transferred to Indiana University. She went to their highly respected business school. She now has a bachelor's in accounting, and she is working in San Jose now after she's moved back to California with PricewaterhouseCoopers, and she is rapidly being promoted and doing an extremely good job. And she's a good mom, and she's in a happy marriage.
It's great to hear she bounced back.
So, my question, every once in a while somebody will ask me if I have regrets in my life, or even to word the question a little differently, is there anything you wish you had done differently? And when I really start to think about that, I think, okay, when I was 21, when I was 35, or maybe even younger, when I was 15, is there anything I wish I had done differently? And I think, well, how can I do that? How can I wish that I had done something differently? Because A, I like my life now. I like my life now a lot. And B, and I think even more fundamental, at the time, let's say when I was 21, if I made what you could call a wrong decision, I was the person I was when I was 21. I wasn't somebody else. And I made the best decision I knew how to make at that time. And in order to have made a different decision, I would have had to have been a different person. And at that point, I have just wished myself out of existence. So how can I wish that I had done something differently? Because to do that is to wish that I didn't exist at some point in time. So I can't think that way. What I can say is that if I had done this or that, I mean, one of the things I've said frequently is that if I had had some life experience, taken a gap year, or maybe even 2 or 3, before I went to UCLA, I probably wouldn't have gone to UCLA. I would have gone to a smaller, more intimate school. But even if I had gone to UCLA, it would have been a much, much richer experience had I had some life experience under my belt. I can say that. But I didn't make that decision. And I don't regret making the decision that I did, which may sound like a contradiction, but as I said, I wish myself out of existence if I think about making a different decision at some point in my life, because I made the best decision I knew how to make at the time.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier a really great phrase, your boldest self.
Right.
Would you share or define what that is and how someone might become and grow into their bolder self?
Okay. I have to get out a piece of paper. This comes, this is like the young woman who saw the movie Top Gun. She saw the movie, it changed the course of her life. Well, I am giving a talk at the conference in July, which I mentioned a couple of times now, entitled Paths to an Authentic Life. And when I decided that was the topic of my talk, I have lots and lots and lots of ideas about people who I think are leading authentic lives. In other words, they are following their passions, they're doing what they love, they're not doing something simply because somebody told them that's what they should do. But then I got to thinking about, okay, in this talk I better be able to define what I mean by authenticity. And I was at a loss. So I actually got a couple of books that were about authentic living, and I didn't find what I wanted. Then I saw a woman interviewed on TV, and I found what she said interesting. I looked up some book reviews of this book, and I got her book, and it's called Presence. And the author is Amy Cuddy, C-U-D-D-Y. And one of the first things I'm going to do in my talk in July is I'm going to quote a single sentence from that book, which I think is the perfect definition of authenticity. Your boldest self emerges through the experience of having full access to your values, traits, and strengths, and knowing that you can autonomously and sincerely express them through your actions and interactions. And I think that's just perfect. And I think there are so many critical words in that definition. Autonomous is one of them. You're doing it on own steam. You're not doing it because you're being forced by somebody else. But I think many, many, many of the words in that definition are critical. Again, this comes from a book called Presence by Amy Cuddy, and in fact is on page 51.
Very nice.
And you know what, Dave, our dinner time is coming up in about 10 minutes. So
Perfect. Last question here.
Okay.
If you could have one message echo through time, long after, our existence has been here, what would you like the next generation or the next wave of folks to know or understand or think about?
One of the people who participated in that group of 13 people that I mentioned a while back became a very good friend. And as a matter of fact, 16 years after she left high school, she introduced me to my wife. My wife is my second wife. She introduced me to my wife. It was a conversation with her that got the ball rolling to start this program in the first place. She became a very good friend. She introduced me to my wife. She's a lifelong friend. She's currently teaching in Shanghai, and she will be here in June because she comes and visits us every year. She's one of my closest friends. She and her husband, her former husband, both went to Berkeley, and we are walking on the Berkeley campus one day, and she says to me, "What's your favorite tree?" And I said, "I don't have a clue. I've never thought about it. I don't have an immediate answer. I don't know what my favorite tree is." 3 years later, I was sitting in a park in Calistoga on a park bench, and I looked up and I saw a tree, and I thought, that is a beautiful tree. And it was a sycamore tree. And so 3 years later, I know what my favorite tree is. And as a matter of fact, when we moved into this house 2.5 years ago, there was a tree that I thought was really ugly at the corner of our front lawn. We took it out and we planted a sycamore tree there. I want a sycamore tree on our property. And all of this is a very, very, very roundabout way of saying, what message, what single message do I want to echo through time is a question I'm going to have to think about, and I don't have an immediate answer to it. And that's the kind of question I'm going to have to think about maybe for years.
Good, well...
But it's going to be about being authentic, living your own life. Don't let somebody else design your life for you. You've got one life to live, at least within certain sorts of religious beliefs. Maybe you think you have many lives to live, I don't know. But live your own life, your own authentic life. I mean, that's the best I can come up with right now.
Well, we thank you very much for spending time with us and sharing some of your nuggets.
Sure.
And perhaps we'll get a chance to sit down and do it again in the future.
Well, I hope they're nuggets. That's what I believe and think, and that's what I'm passionate about.
Any last thing for the viewers you want to wrap up with?
Nope. We think you've asked great questions, and I really can't think of anything else that I think is important right now.
You want to give us a quick tour of Beach High School?
This is it. This one room contains my desk, a bunch of filing cabinets, which are mostly full of student records, a bunch of papers I frequently use, some CDs I listen to, and lots of books, and a sofa for my students and their parents to sit in.
How long have you been graduating students from this high school?
Since 1994.
So you've been in here since 1994?
Well, no, we moved into this house 2.5 years, well, almost 3 years ago now. I was up in the mountains, and interestingly enough, I just happened to have an office that was almost identical to this shape and size. And then when we moved in here, we thought, where's my office going to be? First, it was going to be a bedroom in the house. My wife didn't want people traipsing in and out of the house, and there wasn't a room that was big enough anyway. Then we thought about building a shed out back, but we can't do that because of setback rules. So we finally decided, okay, we'll convert half the garage. And so this is what the thing that I personally am most proud of is that my first thought was that we were just going to have to rip out the whole garage door and make a whole new front of the garage. And then it occurred to me that no, we don't have to do that. We can fix it so that the garage door rolls up over my office, which is why the ceiling there is lower than the other ceiling. The garage door just rolls up over that area. So we didn't have to redo the front of the garage. Saved us a lot of money.
Nice. Well, congratulations. You've changed hundreds and thousands of lives in this little office in both locations. So
thank you much.
thank you for doing what you're doing.
Sure.